I want to philosophize on a perennial issue to deal with negative attachments that are endowed in component compartments of the self, in various aspects of the soul, in our individual being as a soul individual, and with a keen sense of purposing and intent that courses towards knowledge and meaning integration that's directly embedded in our psychological processes that are direct to stimulations and substances that are moving through fluid dynamics in our nervous system and coursing throughout our existence in various ways through the operations and optimistic optimizers and optimizations of the syntheses of the volitional consciousness and conscience of mind that minds and is minding often more thoughtfully in consideration of deeper aspects of knowledge that is important for construing a model of the world that isn't necessarily exact. It's more perceived in relation to its actual, really true, but also perceptual and imaginative, and contains aspects of the unconscious and random sparks of thought bubbles or percolations, you can think about them, a sort of popping up of existence, of content and subject matter that's direct to our subjective experiences. And when we think about meaningfulness that's embedded in these processes, they tend to elaborate knowledge, or what's known through self-knowing, in our direct, individuated, distinctive experiences that have different tastes and flavorings of the qualia, and that's what it's like to have a particular experience, and that's often embedded in a meaningful psychological process with a sense of high or low quality, and being able to directly experience that in your own frames and subjective ways through your lexicons and your terminologies and your ways of engaging in the world through various sets of vocabulary that's actually integrated within the entire nature of our personality structure, as well as the substance of personality structure and the fluid dynamics of the self in particular that encompasses personality and various characteristics and our understandings of the depth and deepening, mind expanding knowledge of the self and knowledge that exists within the minding, volitional, thoughtful mind, that when considering the nature of things like imperfectionism and negative attachments can help us to create an enlightening relation that is not necessarily associated or attached to what pangs us deeply, and which embeds less meaningfulness and more meaninglessness within various aspects of our embody or subjective experience, that is ultimately oriented towards an optimistic, self-strengthening, self-virtuous future for the selves that promotes psychological sustainability, which is really about promoting positivity within the surrounds and our connection to what's objective truth and psychologically true in terms of recognizing individuals' necessitating needs for goods and necessities that maintain our survival through metabolisms and processes of ingestion and digestion that's essential for actually keeping us alive and healthy, psychologically healthy, physically healthy, but also that promotes greater psychological well-being, but also physical well-being and other aspects that aren't well captured within those dimensions that often pertain to an understanding of the nature of meaning in relation to significance, importance, worth, a sense of worthwhileness, or even a sense of awesomeness that tends to be highly meaningful and embedded in a meaningful process that really energizes the self and directs one through these optimistic optimizers that really promote an innate sense of innovativeness, and which can really stimulate ideation and the imaginative consciousness to be able to go in new directions, but also grants it great freedom in terms of its volitional mind and independent I consciousness that it has a subjective experience that's deeply embedded in consciousness, in which I am a subjective experience, in which the contents of consciousness are now present but also subsequent and forthcoming. And in that, we tend to contemplate ourselves in relation to various spontaneities, as well as the issues to do with meaninglessness and meaningfulness, but also purposing and intent, and the sustainability of our own self-strengthening masterfulness, and onlooking towards sunset horizons that expand our creative consciousness to deeper depths of experience that lead to more of these, what I would call awakening experiences, more enlightenment knowledge that pertains to these psychological truths that have these subjective objective relations that are dynamical and operate within these psychological dynamics, and that involve fundamentally materials and substances, and primarily these substances that compose all things, including matter itself and materials, and which operate within these fluid dynamics in which substances, even you could think of them as having material, immaterial, and these incorporeal processes that are embedded within our psychophysiology, and that have to some degree these corporeal elements, but scarcely so, and they tend to be related more to our self-precepts. We tend to operate more on these psychological and these conscious processes, but more that pertain to the volitional mind. And so we tend to more, when we're considering our own infrastructure, have a position in which we're more of a volitional mind, or a mind that has an imaginative consciousness and the capacity to also, in some cases, but there are individual differences, but contemplate various aspects of philosophy in particular, which has mind deepening aspects of knowledge that is radiant to the surroundings, and that promotes essentially repertoires for people to access and strengthen themselves through knowledge and psychological truths and objective truths that are arrived through philosophy. And then once they're there, they're freely and widely available through the freedom of conscience and consciousness, because that's the nature of information and knowledge when you put it out in the substantive thingness that exists in our surrounds, and which tends to directly encompass a self-direction that's oriented towards optimizing learning, and these optimistic optimizers of not just psychological or physical well-being, but psychological sustainability, and psychological sustainability that is deeply concerned with the issues that despair us and which make us contemplate the ceaselessness of our existence. And that can be something that is mind unsettling and deeply disruptive to not just the self, others in the surrounds, but most importantly the volitional mind that is the subjective experience often of I, but also has these relations to me, which has these embedded aspects of consciousness within a thingness that's corporeal, and that has these sensory precepts, but which is deeply embedded and volitionally regulated, sustained, and optimized through incorporeal processing that is psychological in nature, and also pertains to synthetic representative categories that pertain to symbols and representations and categoricals that form these associativities of meaningful knowledge processing that relate deeply to psychological truths of existence, and that are in some cases even a matter of fact in terms of understanding our conduct and our own behaviors and regulations of behaviors, and particularly pertaining to self-regulation and self-intelligence, and an understanding of self-directedness and a mature person, what constitutes a mature working mind, and also what constitutes a good conscience and a virtuous mind and a gooder character and a better individual or a butter individual, a savory flavory individual with these sour splendors of expression and character essence that tends to radiate aspects of virtue that people tend to ideate on and wish to often emulate, because it tends to be something that promotes health, physical health, psychological health, greater well-being, more meaningfulness, and that's always great, but also more knowledge and mind-deepening knowledge and purposing and resourcing of sources and sourcings of resources and consumptions and metabolisms, and also direct meaning that conveys not always what's necessarily meaningful within a emotional sense, though it is deeply emotional, but more in a semantic sense that pertains to thoughtfulness and thought categories of processing that are indifferent to our emotions. So there's an emotional regulation component, so it's deeply emotional, but this pertains to conscious, subconscious, and unconscious processes that also what's usually not talked about, and which I think I might be the only person contemporary that has talked about the sublime consciousness, but that pertains more to a wakefulness, and a wakefulness of expansive imaginative consciousness that tends to be oriented towards masterfulness, self-strengthening, and the natures of self, but also various synthetic natures of consciousness that pertain to these universal and universalizing properties of subjective experience that have these direct embeddedness within the surrounds and nature fundamentally, but also psychological truth foremost and forthcoming in these optimistic, awesome, blastful, in a good conscience, glorious and magnifying, mind expansive, knowledge deepening, depths expanding, mind trajectories towards new heights and potentials and possible possibilities that can actually be as awesome as it is optimistically optimized and embodied to be able to sustain the self through psychological sustainability and our wellness infrastructure, and addressing imperfections and also these negative attachments that tend to hamper that and can also downregulate that and promote a lot of negative emotion or negativity that leads to these ill qualities. And that is what it's like to have, say, a negative experience, what it feels like. Why is this like, why am I experiencing this? What is this hurt like? What is the nature of this hurt? What is the nature of this meaningless sense of triviality to existence when we're considering all the infinite possibilities that we could have, should have, or would have wanted to do in more of a speculative domain, and we turn our speculation instead to these harmful directions rather than positive and self-strengthening directions that have these optimizing and optimistic effects. And when we consider the triviality that's in relation to what we perceive as actually true, really true, or realistically true, there are problems that pertain to our speculations and our imaginative consciousness, but also our what we can hypothesize or what's actually directly true to our experiences and concrete to us, and which provides first-hand and gaze knowledge that pertain to whole categories and categoricals of representative symbolic markings and etchings of psychological truth that has been recorded throughout the meta memory. And that has to do with, say, books or imprints, markings, symbols that have meaning and direct meanings that provide direct knowledge and information. And that allows us to form a sense of what's actually true, really true, possible in relation to our imaginative consciousness and speculations. And we have to sometimes contemplate that there are these meaningful truths that are optimistic optimizers of our existence and awesome. But that requires us to understand what's actually realistically true and really true, and ultimately objective truth in substances and materials and things and consumables and metabolisms and the goods and necessities of life. And so there's meaning to that, and there's knowledge embedded to that in our metabolisms and our consumptions and our embeddedness in existence. And this is direct to our psychological infrastructuring and our psychological sustainable infrastructuring that regulates our psychological, physical health, but also, more importantly, intent, meaningful processes, purposing, resources and sourcings of knowledge, mind-deepening knowledge, self-virtue, imaginative consciousness, and a virtuous conscience and good conscience, and a direction towards universal properties and universalizing principles that can be derived in good conscience through first principles that often pertain to two categories of representative categoricals that pertain to what's true and knowledge, and can be formed into statements about the existence, and that pertains to semantic forms of meaning or knowledge. So when you think of semantic, that essentially means thought, or it means lexicon or a vocabulary, a term, right? It's a thought process often, and related to a thought process. And again, that can be like a marking, an etching. It's often represented as a symbol and character, and it have these universal properties and objective, subjective relations that operate in these psychological, dynamic and fluid ways that have these material and immaterial substances that are substantiated within the nervous system throughout our psychological processing and our direct consciousness awareness and our awarenesses of the self, but also most importantly the volitional mind and subjective experience. And those pertain to essentially the same reciprocal categories, with the exception of the self, and you could say that even the soul included there, and you could also put consciousness to some degree there, but consciousness can be separated into awarenesses. So this is why the mind becomes a very, very useful way of categorizing the world, because you can also think of I as a volitional mind, though that really disregards essential aspects of the self that's necessary and provides the goods to the corporeal elements of the self and the embodier of subjective experience, which tends to be optimistic and promotes greater positivity in the surroundings.